Hello and welcome. Tonight we're stepping far beyond anything familiar. No cities, no engines, no soft glow of electric lamps. Only the quiet wild of the Stone Age, where survival was never promised, and every single day had to be earned through effort, fear, and a small spark of hope. For a moment, try to picture it. A small band of early humans huddles close. The sun has just slipped away, and the world is darker than we can easily imagine. There are no walls, no doors to shut, only the faint silhouettes of trees and the sounds of unseen creatures moving somewhere out there in the black. They don't know how long this night will seem, but they know one thing. They will face it as they always have, armed with nothing but their wits and one another. This is not history kept at arm's length. This is the human story at its true beginning. Before tools were honed, before fire was tamed, before the first faint sparks of civilization brightened the earth, there was a kind of stubborn endurance that carried our ancestors through every season of hunger, every bitter night, and every threat waiting in the shadows. So if you're ready, let the noise of the present slip away a bit. Forget the steady ticking of clocks and the constant drone of modern life. We're going to step slowly, carefully into an age when time wasn't counted in hours, but in sunrises and sunsets. A time when survival wasn't a theory. It was the only thing that mattered. Before the coming of fire, the world was a radically different place for those who came before us. The sun was their only reliable source of light and warmth. When it sank beyond the horizon, the earth changed. Darkness wasn't just the absence of sight. It felt like a presence, a living pressure on the edges of human awareness. When night arrived, so did the cold. So did the sounds of the wild. And in that long stretch between dusk and dawn, staying alive was nothing less than entering into a nightly negotiation with nature itself. Imagine standing in that world. There are no lanterns to thin out the shadows, no low hum of power lines, no safe halo from some distant town beyond the hills. When the sun goes down, it is simply gone, and the sky above becomes a seamless sea of black. The stars glitter sharp, distant, and icy, but they give no heat. The moon sometimes throws a pale wash of light across the land, but it's unreliable, sometimes gone entirely, leaving behind a suffocating dark. And in that darkness, every rustle, every dry snap of a twig is a reminder that humans are far from the only creatures still awake. Without fire, our ancestors depended entirely on their senses and on each other. Tiny groups stayed close together. They learned quickly that a solitary human alone in the night was little more than an easy opportunity for something else. Lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats. These were not distant, abstract fears. They were immediate, pressing realities. To make it through the night, people gathered in numbers. They slept in tight clusters, not because it was pleasant, but because it reduced their odds of being taken. A dozen sets of eyes and ears were better than one. In the absence of fire, constant alertness was their only real defense. In those early ages, fear wasn't an enemy. It was a tool. Fear kept them awake. Fear drove them to find shelter before the sun was fully gone. They used caves when they found them, not just because they shielded them from rain or wind, but because hard stone was easier to guard than open earth. When no cave was nearby, they searched for hollows in the ground or thick tangles of brush where their bodies could be hidden from view. It was far from perfect, but it was something. Cold was another relentless foe. Living now in houses with heating and thick blankets, we easily forget how merciless a single night can be without warmth. Early humans wore whatever materials they could manage. Animal hides draped over shoulders, rough wrappings twisted out of bark, grass, or fibers. They pressed their bodies together to share warmth, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a strategy. To be alone in the freezing dark was to gamble with death. Staying alive meant staying close enough to feel someone else's heartbeat and hoping that the pooled heat of the group would be enough to hold the cold at a distance. And yet, even as they shook with chill in the blackness, they were learning. The Stone Age was not just an era of constant peril. It was an era of constant adjustment. Humans became experts at watching the world and picking out its patterns. They discovered which caves turned away from the prevailing wind. They learned to read the behavior of animals, to feel danger building before it arrived, and to move without sound when the night demanded it. In a world without artificial light, their ears sharpened. The faintest crack of a twig could bring the whole group to perfect stillness. Above them, the sky was its own kind of guide. Long before anyone charted the heavens, people still knew the stars. Not their names or distances, but their reliability. The stars were the only lights that never failed. They signaled when seasons were changing, when it was time to travel, when herds might be on the move. In a life lived without fire, the night sky became their quiet map, their calendar, and their reminder that even in the strangest darkness, there was still some hidden order. Food, of course, was another constant concern after sundown. Without fire, nothing was cooked. They ate anything that could be bitten and swallowed raw leaves and shoots, fruits, roots, and whatever meat could be torn away without boiling or roasting. It was not a menu of comfort. It was a menu of necessity. They learned to chew fibers so tough they would challenge us today, to smash open bones with rocks to reach the fatty marrow inside, and to swallow things that would make most of us hesitate and turn away. Every mouthful counted. Hunger wasn't a passing ache, it was a permanent presence. But need has always been the driving force behind invention. The darkness forced early people to develop routines. While the sun was up, they gathered and hunted, fighting against the shortening day to secure as much as they could. Before the world dropped into black, their movements took on a pressing urgency, a sense of purpose born not out of discipline but out of instinct carved by generations. As the sun began to sink, that urgency tightened. There was no room for hesitation. Those who loitered too long in the open learned quickly what that delay could cost. Predators owned the night, but humans were adaptable. They had strategies long before they ever had flames. They learned to climb trees when danger moved too close. They discovered the survival value of absolute stillness and silence, of seeming to vanish into the landscape instead of challenging it face to face. They understood that sometimes the best way to live was to avoid being noticed at all. Even so, within this hazardous night world, there were occasional pockets of calm. When the group was well hidden, and the distant roar of the wild softened to a low background murmur, they rested. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts. One or two stayed conscious while the others closed their eyes, and then the duty rotated, hour by uncertain hour, until the first gray line of dawn crept back over the horizon. In those hours, our ancestors were building the first foundations of cooperation. They depended utterly on one another. There was no alternative. That reliance on the group, forged in darkness, would grow into one of humanity's defining strengths. Yet there must have been nights of pure panic. Nights when the scraping of claws on rock or the low, rumbling growl of something unseen froze every breath inside their chests. In those moments, all they could do was wait. They clutched stones or sticks, hoping the threat would move on, and sometimes it did not. Survival was never assured. For every band that made it through, others did not. But the ones who did survive learned. Every near miss etched a lesson into memory. At first, those lessons weren't passed down in spoken stories, but in repeated behavior. Children watched and copied. Over generations, those imitations hardened into instinct, and instinct eventually became custom. This was life before the torch and the hearth, a repeating pattern of fear, hunger, and constant adaptation. And buried inside that grind of hardship, something remarkable was taking shape. The human mind itself was being honed. Each problem demanded an answer. Each night in the freezing dark demanded a fresh approach. That never-ending pressure, subtle but relentless, was slowly sculpting a species that would someday learn not just to accept the dark, but to drive it back. When the first signs of fire finally appeared, they did not enter a comfortable world. They arrived in a world where every hint of heat, every tiny gleam, was nothing less than a wonder. Fire would not only change the hours after sunset, it would change what it meant to be human at all. So before firelight ever carved the shadows away, our ancestors learned how to coexist with the blackness. They became watchers of the night, quiet learners of the wild, beings who understood that survival meant bending themselves to the world. They did not rule the earth in those days. They endured it. And by enduring it, they were preparing themselves for the moment that would alter everything. Because once the first flames hissed and crackled, and night ceased to be total, everything that came before would feel like another universe. The first fires humans ever saw did not belong to them. They came from lightning that splintered trees or from distant hillsides when forests went up in flames. Fire then was wild, untamed, and lethal. It was something to recoil from. Seeing a wall of flame roar through trees or creep along dry grasslands must have filled those early people with a mixture of horror and stunned wonder. They had no names for it, no real idea of what it was, but they understood one thing right away. Nothing else in their world behaved like this. In the beginning, fire was only watched from far away, yet survival is often tied to curiosity. Over time, that pure terror softened into fascination. People began to realize that when the land burned, it left opportunities behind. After the blaze passed, they sometimes found animals scorched and cooked where they lay, easier to chew and safer to eat than raw flesh. They noticed that the glow of burning wood made predators hesitate, that creatures that normally circled the edges of their camps kept their distance from the heat. And they felt warmth that sank deep into bone, the kind that the sun could not offer once it was gone. It's hard for us to truly grasp how massive this change was. For uncounted ages, the night had been the enemy. Darkness commanded everything. Cold stabbed into muscle and marrow. Predators stalked freely. Then at some point, humans figured out how to take a piece of that wildfire with them, to carry embers instead of just watching them flare and die. They probably began by stealing live coals from natural burns, cupping them in bark, feeding them with dry grasses and twigs. At first, those coals were incredibly fragile, able to die out as easily as they'd been sparked. But they were enough. For the first time in history, the dark had an edge. Picture a small group gathered around one of those early campfires. Flames crackle and sway, painting the inside of a rock shelter or the nearby trunks in a shifting dance of light. For the first time, the overwhelming blackness beyond is pressed back a little. The bite of the cold is dulled. The sounds of the night, the howls, the rattling leaves, the sudden cracks of unseen branches seem further away. The warmth on their skin is real, but the deeper change is inside them. Fear loosens. Around this circle of light, there is something that feels almost like safety. With fire, humans gained more than heat and illumination. Fire became the first true tool for remaking their environment. Meat could now be roasted, making it easier on their teeth and safer for their bodies. Roots and plants that had been almost inedible raw could be softened and transformed. Their diet widened, and with that added richness, their brains received more of the energy needed to grow. Fire literally fueled our rise into something more complex than we had been. The rulers of the night learned to dread the glow. A ring of flame formed a border that even bold hunters rarely dared to cross. For the first time, humans were no longer completely ruled by the wild. They could guard a patch of ground, create a bright circle where only they belonged. Inside that ring, they were not just clinging to life. They were starting to claim a tiny corner of the world. But fire didn't just shelter and feed them, it drew them together. In the very distant past, when darkness fell and no fire burned, humans scattered to whatever hiding spots they could find, shivering alone or in small knots. Fire changed that. It created a focal point. People came to it not only to be warm, but to be near one another. They made sounds, whether formed words or rough grunts, and used gestures. They traded pieces of food. They shared silence and watchfulness. Within the glow, they became something larger than separate bodies. They became a group, knit together, not only by need, but by connection. This was where something beyond survival truly began. Firelight lengthened the day. Before flames, humans could only be active as long as the sun hung in the sky. When night arrived, the world simply paused until morning. With fire, a new category of time opened up hours reclaimed from the dark, spaces in which tales could be told, edges could be sharpened, and plans for the next day could be shaped. Under that wavering light, the roots of human culture dug into the soil. Over many generations, our ancestors learned not merely to guard existing fires, but to create their own. The discovery that you could coax a spark out of stone or friction must have felt almost supernatural. To slam two rocks together and see a shower of sparks, to drag wooden sticks back and forth until smoke curled and flame bloomed, this was nothing less than seizing control of a force that had once been purely wild. It was power, not in terms of brute strength or speed, but in the sense of transforming the entire relationship between humans and their surroundings. Fire, however, always demanded respect. It never truly became tame. A blaze left unwatched could eat up shelters and force entire bands to flee. Keeping fire alive meant learning its habits, feeding it just enough, shielding it from wind and rain, and constantly checking it. In many ways, those early people were at once masters of the flame and its servants. It was a service they gave willingly, because nothing else gave them so much in return. The more they relied on fire, the more it reshaped them. Cooked food built stronger bodies. Consistent warmth allowed them to survive in places that would once have killed them quickly, pushing small groups into colder, harsher regions. The dark became less paralyzing, and sleep less risky, when predators stayed away from flickering light. Step by step, fire was turning a fragile animal into one that could survive almost anywhere. And in those later hours beside the coals, another change unfolded. With fear blunted and hunger eased, the mind had space to drift. Perhaps it was in the restless patterns of shadow and light cast along cave walls that the first stirrings of imagination awoke. Even now, watching fire is mesmerizing. For those first firekeepers, it must have felt like looking at another world. Maybe on those long nights, as someone pointed to shapes in the moving light and gave them meaning, the first seeds of storytelling fell into place. Even today, there is a feeling to sitting by a fire that seems older than language itself. The crack and pop of burning logs, the slow radiating heat, the instinctive way people arrange themselves in a circle and lower their voices, these are faint echoes of the invention that first made the darkness shareable. Yet fire was never only a gift. It was also a demanding challenge. People had to figure out which wood burned best, how to keep a coal alive through wind and rain, how to hide it from being doused. They had to learn to transport it when they moved camps, carrying glowing embers tucked into bark, bundles of grass, or hollowed-out clay. A single slip could lead to a night without shelter from the cold, without a way to ward off animals, without cooked food. Fire was a treasure that could be lost as easily as it was gained, and every group understood the weight of that risk. Still, those who mastered it flourished. They pushed farther into unknown regions, confident that they could carry their own warmth. They discovered that not only meat, but many plants could be altered over flames, opening up new sources of nourishment. Fire-hardened wooden spear tips, turning them into far more lethal weapons. Gradually, the presence of fire helped shift humanity's role in nature, turning us from almost purely vulnerable prey into something far more formidable. And perhaps the greatest gift fire offered was time itself. With it, humans pushed back the night, lengthened their waking hours, and created new chances to be together. They no longer dropped into sleep the instant the sun vanished. They stayed up. They worked, sharpened, formed, remembered. They began to function not just as animals reacting to what came at them, but as thinkers who could look ahead. The world before fire had been a place of constant dread, harsh chill, and endless caution. The world after it remained dangerous. But now there was a visible border, a circle of heat and brightness where people could gather and feel, even briefly, a little less small. And in that circle, the next major steps in survival were already waiting. Because with fire came not only protection, but the space to build, to learn, and to dream about what else might be possible. Fire gave humans warmth and light. Stone gave them the power to shape their world with their own hands. Long before there were villages, fields, or written marks, there were stones broken and sharpened until they could slice, smash, or pierce. In those early days, survival wasn't only about dodging danger or staying warm. It was about finding ways to act on the world instead of merely reacting to it. The first tools were the proof that humans could do exactly that. Those earliest tools were crude. A broken rock with a jagged edge. A smooth, heavy stone solid enough to crack bone. These weren't inventions in our modern sense, with plans and careful designs. They were discoveries. Perhaps someone accidentally struck two rocks together, and watched one split open into a sharp edge. That edge could cut meat or scrape a hide. A lucky accident became a remembered moment, and that moment turned into something worth repeating. Picture one of those first tools resting in a human hand. It's awkward, rough, and heavy, but to the one holding it, it is a kind of power. With that edge, they can carve flesh away from a carcass far faster, crack open bones to reach the rich marrow, or slice through tough plant fibers that bare fingers could never manage. The gap between empty hands and a sharp stone was the gap between endless struggle and the first hint of control. Over time, these stones changed. People realized that not every rock behaved the same way. Some split cleanly, some dulled in moments, others shattered into useless fragments. Through countless attempts, they learned which types of stone were worth seeking. Flint, obsidian, chert. These became prized not for their color or shape, but for the way they fractured when struck. The best flakes held edges sharp enough to slice hide or carve wood. That sharpness meant less wasted time, less spent effort, and more food. These tools were not just for killing animals. They scraped hides clean, turning them into coverings. They cut skins into pieces that could be wrapped, tied, and worn. They smashed nuts and crushed roots into something easier to chew and digest. They carved and trimmed wood, stripped bark to twist into cord, and scratched marks into surfaces, marks that might have been the first faint impressions of human thought pressed into the world. Each small action, multiplied over countless lifetimes, pushed humans further away from simply surviving and closer to directing their own fate. Tool-making didn't come naturally, like breathing. It had to be learned. Children watched the older members of the group and tried to copy them. They smashed rocks together until the right sound and the right shape appeared. Every falling flake carried a lesson. The wrong strike gave you useless shards. The right one gave you an edge that could decide whether a hunt succeeded or failed. Skills like these couldn't be written down. They lived only in people's minds and muscles. They moved from hand to hand, from elder to child, across centuries, forming a chain of knowledge as old as humanity itself. These tools changed hunting. Before sharp stones, scavenging was the norm. Early humans often followed after big predators, waiting for lions or other carnivores to gorge themselves and move off. Then they rushed in to grab what scraps remained: a snapped bone full of marrow, a strip of meat still clinging to the skeleton. Those leftovers were survival. But with stone blades, humans could strip a carcass quickly and efficiently. They could cut more meat, carry more of it away, and leave less to the other scavengers trailing behind them. Slowly, they began to transition from scavengers to true hunters. The first spears weren't elegant weapons. They were simply sharpened sticks, sometimes hardened over a fire. But once a sharp stone point was fixed to the end, everything changed. A wooden spear could wound. A spear tipped with stone could kill. With that improvement, hunting shifted from wild, desperate charges to something more controlled. Small animals gave way to larger targets. Groups that once depended on luck began to stalk prey with intention. Yet stone tools weren't only used on animals. They reshaped almost every part of daily life. Sturdy tools made building stronger shelters possible. Sharp edges let them work tougher materials: wood, bone, tendon, hide. Tools helped them defend their territory. A rock blade or spear lashed to a stick could be the difference between forcing a predator back and being dragged off his food. In that sense, tools were more than objects. They were new teeth and claws, forged not from flesh and bone, but from stone and determination. Making tools also demanded something new from the human mind: the ability to think ahead. To shape an edge or carve a spearhead, they had to picture the end result before it existed. That required more than instinct. It demanded planning, the ability to hold an idea in the mind and then bring it into the world. This quiet leap from reacting to imagining was as transformative as the discovery of fire. Tools encouraged cooperation. One person could chip a blade, but everyone benefited from a skilled toolmaker. Someone who was especially good at shaping stone became as necessary as the strongest hunter. One might sit at the edge of camp, flint in hand, while others brought meat or prepared hides. In this way, roles emerged, and with roles came the first faint outline of something bigger than simple survival, a kind of social structure. Even in their simplicity, those early tools contained the blueprint of everything that followed. The strike of flint on stone was the ancestor of engineering. The first sharpened stone tied to a stick was the ancestor of all technology. Each tool stood as a quiet declaration that humans would not accept the world exactly as they found it. They would alter it chip by chip, edge by edge. As tools improved, the human environment changed with them. Sharper blades meant hides could be cut neatly and stitched with sinew into garments that kept out the cold. Heavier stone hammers cracked bones clean, squeezing out every last bit of marrow. Delicate scrapers shaped wood into handles, poles, or supports for shelters. Survival began to mean more than simply hanging on. It started to mean reshaping conditions, adjusting, improving, and gradually mastering. Even so, life never became easy. A broken edge at the wrong moment could cost a meal. A failed spear throw could mean several days of hunger. No matter how carefully crafted, every tool was only as effective as the hands using it. So humans practiced. They chipped stone not only when they needed new blades, but also because, in some deep, unspoken way, they understood that preparation could draw the line between life and death. During long nights around the fire, while predators prowled just outside the light, stones were slowly turned into sharper forms. The faint tap of flint on flint echoed in the shadows, a rhythm as old as our species. With every spark, every sliver of rock that fell to the ground, every edge refined, humans cut a little further into the future they would inhabit. The journey from bare hands to stone tools wasn't a single leap. It was a slow, grinding ascent made of countless small victories. But each piece of stone carried the same message. People were learning not only to withstand the world, but to alter it, one careful strike at a time. And once tools were in their hands, they were ready for the next force that would transform them, the power of language, which would bind them together and make survival a shared effort instead of a solitary struggle. A sharp stone in the hand gave humans power. Language gave them the power to use it together. Before words, survival was limited to what each person could see and do alone. But the world was too hazardous, and life too demanding, for anyone to face it completely by themselves. The ability to share warnings, plan hunts, pass on knowledge, or offer comfort was not just a useful advantage. It was often the deciding factor between living and dying. At first, this communication was not language as we know it. It was sound and motion. Cries, grunts, and gestures held meaning long before anyone wove full sentences. A lifted hand could mean danger. A short, sharp call might send everyone scattering for cover. Gradually, these signals grew more precise. A single gesture could point to not just predator, but which predator and in which direction. Each small refinement made survival more secure. Imagine a group moving quietly through tall grass searching for game. One hunter spots movement, a faint shadow against the horizon. Without words, using only sounds and signs, he alerts the others. They don't panic. They shift, spread out, and prepare, each one understanding what is being communicated. No one has to guess what to do. No one is left behind. What began as raw instinct has become something more, a shared system held in common by the whole group. Language didn't appear overnight. It expanded slowly, pulled forward by need. A particular sound used again and again began to carry more weight. A gesture repeated across many hunts turned into a standard signal everyone recognized. As children watched and copied, these meanings were passed down until they became automatic, a woven part of daily life, rather than something newly invented each time. These first forms of communication were more than just practical tools. They created trust. When someone signaled the location of food or warned of a stalking predator, and the group responded and survived, that interaction deepened their bond. Each successful exchange reinforced a simple truth. Together, they were safer than any individual could ever be alone. The hunt was transformed by communication. Alone, a human could only chase small creatures. Working in sync, they could plan. One part of the group could flush animals in a certain direction while others waited ahead, ready to intercept. They could block escape paths, guide herds into narrow valleys or towards hidden traps, and spring forward at the right moment. Even crude language simple sounds and signs turned scattered individuals into something closer to a single, coordinated force. Language also changed how people cared for one another. A wounded hunter could show where he was hurt or signal that he could no longer walk. Those tending the fire could call others back when the food was ready. Infants unable to speak could still be calmed by soothing sounds, their cries answered by gentle vocal reassurance. Even in its earliest form, communication carried more than commands. It carried comfort. Language was also a kind of memory. Before it, knowledge existed only in action. You could learn by watching someone knap stone or clean a hide, but you couldn't easily explain what should be done differently. Once sounds were linked to meanings, people could pass along experience. A particular word or sound might identify a safe plant, a dangerous river crossing, or a reliable hunting ground. Each shared signal was a thread connecting past to present, allowing the hard-earned lessons of one generation to live on in the next. From this, the first stories emerged. Not elaborate myths at the beginning, but simple accounts. A retelling of a hunt, a description of a close escape. These weren't just memories. They were instructions wrapped in narrative. They gave meaning to events, taught lessons without formal teaching, and allowed information to travel farther and last longer than any individual life. With every exchange, the human mind was being sharpened. Language demanded not just sound, but memory, association, and imagination. To say there or later meant you had to understand distance and time beyond the immediate moment. In that way, the need to survive was quietly pushing the human brain towards something far more powerful than simple reaction. Of course, communication was never flawless. Misunderstandings must have been common. A panicked signal might be misread. A sound might mean one thing to one group and something entirely different to another. But even with its imperfections, language worked well enough to hold people together. Once they were linked by shared sounds and gestures, their struggle for survival shifted from an individual fight to a collective enterprise. As fires burned into the late hours, language likely grew richer. In that protective glow, away from the urgent demands of the chase, there was time for more than emergency signals. Sounds began to label things. Objects and places were given names. Over uncounted nights, humans learned how to turn scattered cries into a rough, growing vocabulary. With that vocabulary came a deeper sense of belonging to their world. Language carried something else as well, the power to imagine together. Once two people could share an idea, they could picture what did not yet exist. They could discuss the hunt before it happened, decide how to corner a particular animal, or choose where to move when the seasons turned. That was a step beyond instinct. It was cooperation shaped by thought. As language spread, so did the beginnings of culture. Habits and rituals passed more easily from one person to another. The techniques for making a tool, binding a wound, or following a trail could now be taught and refined instead of merely copied. What had once depended mostly on imitation could be explained, corrected, and improved. Language became a kind of memory that lived outside any single mind, carried in the voices of the group. That's still true. When people speak today, they're not just sending information back and forth. They're echoing an ancient habit that began around small fires in a dangerous world, when a single cry could mean survival. Those earliest words, rough, limited, and unsteady, gave humans something unique. The ability to survive not as isolated creatures, but as a shared intelligence. From that, everything else eventually grew. But at the start, it was simple. A sharp call to warn of danger, a gesture to show food, a sound to draw others close when the night got too quiet. Language began not as a tool for deep thought, but as a lifeline. And in that role, it became one of the most powerful forces in our history. With their voices, even in their simplest form, humans stopped just reacting to the world. They began shaping it together. And with voices and tools joined, they were ready to face their most constant daily battle, finding enough to eat. With tools in their hands and the first hints of language on their tongues, humans confronted the struggle that never really ended, the search for food. Hunger was a constant pressure. It influenced every move, every choice, every risk. Without steady food, there could be no rest, no stability, no future. Hunting and gathering were not two separate tasks. They were intertwined aspects of one ongoing fight, and both demanded everything early humans could offer. Hunting had begun long before anyone became truly skilled at it. In the earliest stages, people were primarily scavengers. They followed in the wake of bigger predators, waiting for a lion or other carnivore to finish its kill and move off. With sharp stones, they sliced meat from the bones faster than other scavengers could manage. They pounded those bones open to reach the marrow hidden inside a rich, fatty store of energy that most animals could not easily access. It was a risky way to eat, but it was clever. By learning to make use of what others left behind, humans carved out a fragile niche in a world that rarely gave second chances. But there was a limit to how many mouths scavenging could feed. As groups grew larger and stone tools grew sharper, the focus began to shift. Small creatures, hares, birds, lizards, became early targets. These hunts were quick and chaotic, depending on surprise and stubbornness. A single small animal could mean the difference between going to sleep hungry and making it through another day. With time, the scope of the hunt widened. Humans began to trail bigger animals' prey that could feed an entire band, but also injure or kill anyone who came too close. Cooperation became essential. One hunter alone had little hope of bringing down a deer or antelope. A group working in sync could drive a herd toward an ambush, push an animal into a narrow pass, or trap it along steep ground. They learned to use the wind to hide their scent and to spread out over the landscape, herding animals toward waiting spear throwers. When the killing blow finally came, it was violent and swift, followed by a wash of relief. Every successful hunt offered more than full stomachs. It was proof that their skill, their planning, and their trust in each other had been justified. Hunting required more than courage or strength. It demanded patience, knowledge, and a deep familiarity with the land. Hunters learned to read tracks pressed into damp soil, to follow a trail of broken stems or disturbed leaves, to recognize the tiny scattered droppings that revealed an animal's recent passing. They learned the timing of the seasons, when certain herds migrated, when others were weak or breeding. Each hunt tested not only their endurance but their powers of observation. Even the best hunters failed often. A poorly thrown spear, a shifted wind carrying human scent to a sensitive nose, or the sharp vigilance of a wary animal could turn hours of stalking into an empty-handed return. On those nights, gathering plants, fruits, and roots kept everyone alive. Foraging was just as crucial as hunting. Early humans became careful students of the vegetation around them. They discovered which berries were edible and which were deadly, which roots could be dug up, peeled, and eaten, and which needed special treatment before they were safe. They smashed nuts between stones and collected every tiny piece. This work was slow and quiet, far from the drama of the chase, but no less vital. A small haul of berries, a basket of tubers, or a handful of nuts could stretch a meager supply of meat and carry the group through lean days. The knowledge needed for this kind of gathering was immense. Plants changed with the seasons. Some were edible only when ripe. Others had to be soaked, boiled, or pounded before they could be consumed. Guesswork was dangerous. One mistake could poison a single person or a whole group. So, across generations, people passed down an unwritten library of understanding, where certain plants grew, how to prepare them, and which signs meant danger. That knowledge lived not in books, but in stories, habits, and watchful eyes. Food gathering also shaped how humans moved. Bands followed the rhythm of their meals. They walked with migrating herds, or they returned season after season to the same fruitful stands of plants. They learned animal roots, not only to hunt them, but also to scavenge what they left behind. A carcass discarded by a predator, seeds dropped by birds, remains abandoned by other scavengers. Nothing was ignored. Gradually, hunting and gathering balanced each other. Meat offered dense, concentrated energy. Plants brought reliability. Together, they created the mix that allowed humans to survive where many other creatures could not. When one source failed, the other often filled in. That flexibility was a unique strength. Humans could eat almost anything and endure in almost any environment. But neither hunting nor foraging was free of risk. The hunt required boldness and endurance. Foraging called for constant attention. A hunter might face a charging animal. A gatherer could reach into brush and meet poisonous thorns, a hidden snake, or a crouching predator. Every step taken in search of food carried the awareness that a single lapse could be fatal. Despite this, the hunt and the harvest became more than daily chores. They grew into rituals. A successful hunt meant more than full bellies. It meant a brief taste of security, a moment to rest and feel that the harsh world had been held at bay. Foraging trips, often done in smaller groups, were quieter but just as meaningful. People shared knowledge as they walked, pointed out safe plants and hidden dangers, and forged social bonds as strong as any spear. Food kept bodies functioning, but it also bought time and energy. A group that ate well had the strength to explore new lands, craft better tools, and teach their children. Hunger pushed them forward, but every meal nudged them slightly away from desperation and toward genuine mastery of their surroundings. Step after step, mouthful after mouthful, the twin tracks of hunting and gathering carried humanity through the long Stone Age. They learned not just how to survive in hostile places, but how to thrive where many creatures could not. They became hunters, gatherers, and above all, problem solvers. Yet food was only one battle. A full belly could not stop the wind or keep the rain out. For that, humans needed something else. Shelter strong enough to stand between their fragile bodies and the relentless wild, even if only for a little while. Food gave humans the strength to endure, but strength by itself was never enough. The world was too cold, too wet, too unforgiving for bare skin and open ground. Rain turned the earth into sucking mud. Winds howled across open plains, stripping warmth from the body in minutes. Winter nights froze the air so sharply that every breath felt like fire in the lungs. Without protection, even the strongest hunter or the most skilled gatherer would not survive for long. Shelter became as essential as fire or food, a barrier between human frailty and the relentless forces of nature. At first, shelter was not something humans built. It was something they discovered. Caves and rocky overhangs offered natural refuge from storms and cold. For countless generations, these stone hollows were the safest places people could find. Inside, the wind dropped to a whisper, the sound of rain softened, and the darkness felt contained rather than limitless. Predators could still enter, but a single narrow opening was far easier to guard than the open wild. Families and small groups clustered together inside these stone refuges, using the earth itself as armor. But caves were not everywhere. Vast regions had none, and those that did often held dangers of their own. Other groups already living inside, or the very predators humans were trying to escape. When caves could not be found or claimed, people adapted. They began to build. Their first constructed shelters were extremely simple. Branches leaned together to break the wind, hides stretched over poles, shallow pits dug into the earth and covered with brush. Crude as they were, these barriers could turn a night of bitter exposure into a night that simply had to be endured. As time passed, these shelters grew more advanced. Groups learned to use the bones of huge animals, especially mammoths and other large prey as frameworks. They draped these bone frames with hides, weighing them down with stones to keep out the wind. Sometimes they dug shallow depressions beneath their shelters to sit lower in the ground, trapping warmth and cutting the bite of the air. Each improvement came from dire need. The difference between a flimsy shelter and a sturdy one could mean the difference between waking up or never waking at all. Inside those makeshift homes, life developed a different rhythm. Outside, danger lurked, predators moving in the dark, storms swirling, the constant uncertainty of the open land. Inside, there was the glow of the fire, the smell of drying hides, the slow breathing of people sleeping shoulder to shoulder. The walls might be thin and temporary, but they created something humans had barely known before. A space that felt like theirs. Shelter was more than physical coverage. It altered the way humans lived. Once a group could build and maintain their own refuge, they no longer had to wander endlessly searching for caves or lucky overhangs. They could stay in one place for longer stretches. That meant they could store food, improve tools, and care for their children without constantly uprooting camp. Even if they still moved with the seasons, these early shelters gave them a level of stability the wild itself could never offer. Shelters became the first real centers of human life. Within these spaces, people sharpened tools, scraped and softened hides, and planned the next hunt. Children watched their elders, learning how to prepare food, how to twist cordage, how to shape weapons in the dim light of a fire. Stories spoken or conveyed by gesture and expression were shared within those walls. What happened outside determined whether they lived. What happened inside determined how they lived together. Building and keeping these shelters standing required teamwork. No single person could drag the enormous bones of a mammoth into place or stretch a massive hide over a whole frame. Groups had to coordinate their efforts, some lifting, some tying, some stacking stones, while others gathered firewood or watched for threats. Shelter was more than just protection from a storm. It was proof that humans could depend on each other in ways no other animal did. The changing seasons forced them to keep adapting. In warmer times, shelters were lighter, simple structures designed mostly to keep out rain and offer shade from the sun. In winter, they became low and thick, built closer to the ground to trap heat and block the wind. Some groups even stuffed grass, moss, or other plant material into gaps to insulate their homes. These modest refinements added up, making it possible to survive in climates their bodies alone could never have tolerated. Still, shelter was never perfect. A wall of hides couldn't silence the distant howling of wolves or blot out the shadow of a prowling cat passing by in the night. It couldn't stop every storm or seal out the freezing air completely. But it bought time. It gave people space to rest, heal, and think. It turned life from a frantic sprint into something more like a grueling, steady push forward. And with each storm that raged outside while they stayed relatively dry and alive inside, shelter became something else. A source of confidence. For the first time, humans could face the fury of wind and rain and feel that they had a chance to stand against it. That tiny sense of control fueled the next steps in their evolution. Shelter also allowed for something as important as warmth or safety, the capacity to imagine the future. A secure camp meant that for a few precious hours, people could sit by the fire and think beyond the next sunrise. They could plan the coming hunt, try new ways of shaping tools, or repair what had been broken. Inside these fragile walls, human life gained a rhythm. Days began to build on each other instead of erupting from chaos anew each morning. But nature never let them forget they were only borrowing space. Fierce winds could rip apart frames. Sudden floods could wash away entire camps. Predators learned to linger near human shelters, knowing hunger would eventually force someone out into the open. Survival was never absolute, only extended. Yet every new shelter, no matter how rough, was a promise. People were no longer satisfied with being chased across the land by weather or driven away by cold. They were learning to hold the ground beneath their feet. Those first shelters of wood, hide, and bone were small acts of defiance against a world that seemed vast and unstoppable. They didn't conquer the storm, but they refused to surrender completely to it. Within those thin walls, fragile, drafty, and easily torn humanity discovered something that would define it forever. The determination to create a world of their own, even if it started with nothing more than sticks, stones, and a fierce desire to survive one more night. And as they sat inside, listening to wind scream and rain hammer the earth, they knew that beyond their slender defenses, other threats still moved in the dark. Because storms could be waited out, and cold could be endured. But something else was always watching. The predators of the night. Even inside their shelters, early humans could never shake the feeling of being observed. The night itself seemed full of eyes. Every twig snapping or low growl past the flicker of the fire was a reminder. Humans were not alone in the dark. Predators owned the hours between dusk and dawn. If people wanted to keep living, they had to learn how to face that reality. In those days, fear was not a flaw. It was a survival tool. Fear tuned every sense, forcing people to pay attention to even the quietest sounds that most animals ignored. They learned to notice the faint rustle of grass that might mean a stalking cat, or the distant, crooked laughter of hyenas circling in the black. The world after sunset was a dangerous stage, and every noise, every shadow, was a cue they could not afford to miss. Because of this, humans developed a habit that has followed us ever since. They kept watch. While some slept, others stayed awake, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the flames. These watchers listened for the heavy steps of a bear, the sharp crack of a branch under something large, or the nearly silent pad of a predator's paws. Sleep came in shifts light, broken, and brief, but it was enough to keep the group alive. The fire helped, but it was not a perfect shield. Many animals avoided the glow, but desperation could drive even cautious predators to take bold risks. A starving pack of wolves or a famished big cat might still creep close, testing the edge of firelight. Humans learned quickly that they could never fully relax. One moment of inattention, one drowsy lapse, and the night could claim someone. These night watchers did more than just spot danger. They studied it. Humans became careful observers of the creatures that hunted them. They learned to distinguish different calls in the dark, which sounds meant distant threats, and which signaled immediate peril. They noticed how lions moved in near silence, how hyenas cackled and shrieked, how leopards dragged their kills up into the trees. Bit by bit, knowledge turned raw fear into strategy. To survive, they had to understand what else moved through the same darkness. In a strange way, the night gave them discipline. They learned to take turns, to hand off responsibility from one watcher to the next, trusting that while they slept, someone else stood guard. That trust knit the group tighter. Night watchers were more than guards. They were the thread that kept the tribe from unraveling into anxious, sleepless individuals. Because someone was always awake, others could risk closing their eyes. Children grew up in a world shaped by this constant alertness. They heard the soft warnings murmured by their parents, the quiet sounds that brought everyone to stillness, the sharp calls that meant, "Danger now." These lessons sank deep, becoming nearly instinctive. By the time they were old enough to join the watch, they could read the night almost as easily as their elders. Predators influence more than behavior. They influence tools. Spears and sharpened stones were not only meant for bringing down prey, they were also weapons of defense. People learned to sleep with weapons nearby, within arm's reach. A sudden shout from a watcher could bring the entire group to their feet, weapons raised toward whatever threatened the edge of their camp. Each successful defense bred confidence but not carelessness. In the Stone Age, caution wasn't optional. It was the price of staying alive. Even as humans guarded themselves against the night, they adapted to moving through it. They learned to step softly when they had to leave camp after dark. They read the wind so their scent would not betray them to unseen hunters. Their eyes adjusted to starlight. Their ears grew tuned to the faintest movements. For every predator that learned to stalk them, they learned how to stalk the night itself. The presence of predators also pushed humans closer together. Alone, a person had little chance against a lion or a pack of wolves. Together, they were something else entirely, something even the fiercest hunters hesitated to challenge. When danger came too near, the group did not scatter in panic. They drew together, backs to the fire, spears pointing outward into the dark. Their unity, born out of shared fear, became one of their greatest strengths. Over time, all those sleepless, vigilant nights produced more than physical safety. They produced awareness. Humans learned not only the habits of predators, but the broader rhythms of the wild. They noticed which nights the howls came closest when certain creatures were on the move, and how an unnaturally quiet forest could be either a sign of peace or a warning of something unseen. They weren't just surviving in the dark, they were mapping it, decoding it, and slowly learning to master it. Still, the night never truly belonged to them. It remained a place where danger gathered, a realm largely ruled by other creatures. But by keeping watch, by guarding each other through the long hours, humans learned to endure it. They became the animals that stayed instead of fleeing, that stood their ground even when the sky went black. Every sunrise was a victory. Each dawn, seen by the watchers, was proof. One more night survived. The predators never disappeared. But humans changed. They became the ones who watched back. This constant struggle with the dark taught them something that would apply to far more than just nighttime. Survival was not only about strength or weapons. It was about staying alert, remembering what had happened before, and continuing on even when fear never fully went away. And out of those long, tense nights came the first true foundation of human endurance, the knowledge that danger would always exist, and that they would face it anyway. As they sat around their fires, weapons close at hand, eyes fixed on the moving shadows beyond the light, they began to do something that had nothing to do with fear at all. They started to leave marks on their world, to scratch shapes into stone, to depict what they saw in the firelight and in their minds. Because after learning to watch the night, they learned how to really see it, and then they began to paint it. In the safety of their shelters, with fires burning low and night held back by those faithful watchers, humans started to do something unexpected. They drew. These drawings were not food, not weapons, not fuel. They didn't push back the cold or drive away a single predator. Yet deep inside caves and on hidden walls lit only by flickering flames, they began to mark the world around them. The first images were simple. The outline of an animal, the negative shape of a hand, rough lines scratched or dabbed onto stone. But even the earliest marks were intentional. They weren't random scrawls. Someone chose a piece of charcoal or a colored mineral, pressed it to the rock, and dragged it along. In that act, survival took a small step beyond the next hunt or storm. It reached for memory. These images were more than decoration. They were records. A herd of animals carved or painted on a cave wall might have served as a reminder of where they had been seen, or an effort to pass that knowledge toward the future. A row of dots might have counted days, hunts, or phases of the moon. We can only guess at the exact meanings now. But to the people who made them, these walls became something more than raw stone. They became a way to speak across time. Some of these works are astonishingly detailed. In caves now famous in places like Lascaux and Chauvet, painted thousands of years apart, the animals appear almost alive. Horses seem to run across the rock, their bodies layered with strokes of ochre and charcoal. Mammoths trudge in heavy, dark shapes. These aren't clumsy drawings. They're careful studies. Whoever painted them had watched these creatures closely. They understood how muscles stretched when an animal galloped, how antlers curved, how eyes caught light in the dark. These paintings are proof of a level of attention going far beyond what was required just to eat. Why draw at all? Some believe these pictures worked like a visual language, teaching the young what to recognize before they ever saw it in the wild. A child could learn the silhouette of a bison or a deer from the cave wall before spotting one in the grass. Others think the images served some deeper, more spiritual purpose. That painting a successful hunt was a way to call it into being. A ritual meant to tilt the odds in their favor. There may have been another layer too. In firelight, those images would not have been still. Shadows dancing over the uneven rock would have made the painted animals shift and flicker as if they were moving. That illusion, born from light, stone, and imagination together, must have felt almost magical. For the people who painted them, this might have been the first kind of moving picture, a blending of reality and vision that stirred something deep in the mind. Not all the images showed animals. Many caves contain handprints, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them. Some are tiny, belonging to children. Others are larger, roughened by life and labor. Each one says the same thing. I was here. In a world where life was short and uncertain, pressing your hand against the stone and leaving a mark was a way of pushing back against invisibility, a way of claiming a moment of existence that might outlive your own heartbeat. These early artists did not work in solitude. People likely gathered deep in the caves, carrying torches to cut through the dark as someone painted. The air would have smelled of smoke and damp rock. The scraping of tools against stone would have mixed with low voices. In those moments, humans were not only surviving together, they were creating together. The art itself became a shared language that needed no translation. A painted mammoth or horse could be understood by anyone who saw it. A line of handprints said everything without words. This was more than distraction. It was part of being human, The same brains that shaped tools and planned hunts were now creating symbols and imagery. People were no longer just responding to the world. They were starting to interpret it. Every line on the cave wall was a quiet step toward a more abstract way of thinking, one that reached beyond immediate hunger or fear and into questions of meaning. Those caves became places of memory and identity. Imagine a child being led into a dark chamber, torchlight revealing walls covered in painted animals and hands. No one would have to explain why it mattered. The feeling of it, the silence, the age, the sense that others had stood here before, would speak for itself. These marks weren't just pictures. They were a conversation stretched out across generations, a reminder that each person belonged to a story older than their own life. As the images multiplied, they connected people not only to one another, but to the animals and forces they depended on. Painting a creature meant studying it more carefully than ever. It meant noticing curves and lines, movement and form. In drawing the world, humans were learning it more deeply, permanently fixing it in memory. The process of art sharpened their understanding of the very things they needed to survive. Those paintings are still with us. They wait deep in caves, sheltered from time, silent evidence of the minds that first reached beyond immediate need towards something greater. They remind us that long before farming, writing, or cities, people were already reaching past survival toward meaning. But while they painted, life outside the cave didn't pause. The wind still cut through their shelters. The cold still clawed at their skin. Sooner or later, they had to step back out into the wild. For all their growing creativity, they were still bound by one hard fact. The world would not slow down for them. It would change, and they would have to follow. As humans painted the walls of their caves and shaped their tools beside the fire, their lives were still ruled by movement. They followed the turning of the seasons, the paths of the herds, and the subtle rhythms of the land. But slowly, in some places, something began to shift. The endless wandering started to give way to a new pattern, the first hints of staying put. These earliest villages were nothing like the ones we picture today. There were no streets, no fences, no permanent houses lined up in neat rows. They were simply places people returned to again and again, drawn by safety, water, or food. A gentle bend in a river rich with fish. A grove where wild fruit reliably ripened each year. An open stretch where herds passed by in predictable seasons. Over time, these spots became more than temporary camps. They became familiar ground. Because groups started coming back to the same places, their shelters gradually changed. Instead of flimsy barriers thrown together just to survive a few nights, they built sturdier structures meant to last a little longer. Hides stretched over heavier frames, walls shored up with branches, rough circles of stone anchored their shelters against the wind. Still simple but more deliberate. The land was no longer just something they passed through. It was something they began to shape. Staying in one place, even for only part of the year, changed almost everything. Fires no longer had to be born from scratch each night. They could be kept alive for weeks or months. Tools could be left behind and found again, instead of carried across every mile. Food, when there was enough of it, could be dried, smoked, and stored instead of eaten all at once. For the first time, humans had the beginnings of a buffer against the unpredictable, the earliest hint of surplus. But settling, even part-time, brought new problems. A camp that stayed in one place gathered waste and leftovers. That drew animals, scavengers, and predators alike. Larger groups living close together had to find ways to share space without constantly splitting apart. Predators could learn where humans slept and fed, turning the camp itself into a hunting ground. Humans responded by organizing more carefully. They clustered shelters together, close enough for the fire's light to overlap and strengthen one another. They stationed watchers at the edges, just as they had at night in smaller camps. The first real sense of community grew, not from comfort, but from necessity. With these early settlements came new forms of connection. Knowledge traveled faster. A skilled maker of tools could teach several people at once, and those techniques didn't vanish when the group moved. They stayed with the camp, then spread when people departed and returned. Hunters could share what they had learned about a particular valley or herd path. Those too weak or injured to keep up on long journeys could still be cared for inside the relative safety of the gathering place. These early camps also created something rare and precious: time. With so many people together, not everyone needed to hunt or gather at the same moment. Some could focus on repairing tools, working hides, or maintaining fires, while others went out in search of food. Work started to divide not just by immediate need, but by skill. People began to have roles, and together those roles supported the survival of all. The land itself began to show signs of this new way of living. Footpaths formed where bare feet had tread the same routes over and over. Fire pits darkened the soil where flames had burned in the same spot for weeks. Bones, ash, and broken tools built up in layers, leaving behind the faint beginnings of what we now recognize as settlements. These places were still, not truly permanent, but they were no longer fleeting either. They were something in between, a bridge between the roaming life and the deeply rooted life yet to come. And as humans stayed longer in one spot, they also learned to protect it more deliberately. They stacked branches to form crude barriers, or piled stones into low walls. They cleared brush around their shelters so they could see anything approaching. For the first time, they pushed the wild back, even if only a short distance from where they slept. Yet these first villages were more than just practical arrangements. They became emotional centers. In the glow of several fires burning near each other, people gathered not only for warmth, but for companionship. They shared the details of the day's hunt. They taught children what to fear, what to follow, and what to respect. They joked, argued, comforted, and grieved. Around these shared hearths, life became something more than an individual struggle. It became a shared story. Lingering in the same place season after season, people formed attachments to the land itself. A certain river bend was no longer just a good fishing spot. It was where a child had taken their first steps. A patch of flat ground was not just a campsite. It was where a difficult winter had been survived, or where an especially successful hunt had been celebrated. Memory tied humans to place in ways they had never felt before. With each returning season, the camps grew a bit. One more shelter, a larger fire, a few more hands to help carry, build, and keep watch. Over time, these clusters became something recognizably new. Not just camps, but early villages. Still rough, still movable, but with deeper roots each year. The roaming life did not end, not yet. People still traveled with the herds, still crossed unfamiliar lands in search of better ground. But the appearance of these semi-permanent villages proved that humans were beginning to bend the land to fit their needs, rather than always bending themselves to the land. And within these villages, around the communal fires and among groups that stayed together longer, something else quietly deepened. As people lived and worked more closely, they found new ways not only to survive, but to help one another heal when survival came at a price. Life in the first villages allowed for a measure of security, but danger never went away. Injuries were constant. A misjudged leap or a misstep on a hunt could leave a deep gash or a broken bone. A fall on wet rock, a tangle with an animal, or a sharp tool slipped in the wrong direction, any of these could cripple or kill. Illness came again and again. Fevers that burned, coughs that clung to the lungs, infections that spread silently through the body. There were no doctors, no written knowledge of how the body worked. Survival often depended on simple hands, improvised materials, and memories of what had worked before. The earliest form of medicine was not expertise, it was instinct and care. When someone was hurt, others reached for them. They pressed hands to wounds to slow the bleeding. They wrapped injuries with whatever was available, strips of hide, softened bark, braided grasses. They learned that cool water soothed hot skin, that stillness helped broken limbs, and that warmth from the group could pull someone back from the edge. Healing, in its first form, began not with theory, but with compassion. Over time, instinct turned into something more focused. Humans noticed patterns. Certain plants seemed to numb pain. Others reduced swelling. Some made things worse, and those were remembered too. A bitter root might ease a fever. Crushed leaves might calm an angry wound. Smoke from particular woods could clear breathing. Smoke from others choked and harmed. None of this was written down. It was stored in memory, passed from one person to another in quiet words by the fire. The same hands that threw spears and built shelters also became the first healers' tools. Fingers probed for pieces of stone or dirt in wounds. Palms rested against foreheads, learning to feel the difference between normal warmth and dangerous heat. Splints of bone or wood were bound to broken limbs with strips of sinew or fiber, holding bones in place while the body did its slow work. People didn't know why these methods succeeded when they did. They only knew that sometimes they helped, and that was reason enough to repeat them. Pain and survival together became teachers. If a certain treatment seemed to save lives, it was remembered and tried again. If it repeatedly failed, it was eventually abandoned. Over many generations, this painful process of trial and error turned into a kind of living medical tradition. Within each group, some people naturally became keepers of this knowledge. Often they were elders, too frail to hunt, but rich in memory. They had seen more sickness and more recovery than anyone else. They were the ones others turned to when fear and pain demanded answers. They had no titles, no healer in the sense we use now, but they carried the tribe's experience in their minds. Healing was never purely physical. Comfort mattered too. A steady hand on a shoulder, a low hum or murmured words of reassurance, a gentle presence nearby. All these things helped someone endure pain and remain calm enough for the body to heal. Even without knowing the biology behind it, humans learned that being cared for made survival more likely. Those tended to carefully were more likely to cling to life than those left alone. In this way, healing was never just about herbs or splints. It was also about emotional connection. The land itself supplied the earliest medicines. Plants offered leaves for poultices, roots for chewing, and saps and resins that could seal or protect wounds. Some groups burned strong-smelling herbs in their shelters, hoping the smoke would chase away sickness. Others discovered that certain clays cooled burns or that salt could help clean a cut. Each discovery was precious, passed along in stories or demonstrations, preserved by those who had witnessed its effects firsthand. Even death taught its lessons. A hunter who died from an infected cut left behind knowledge for those who watched the infection spread and understood that dirt and filth made wounds worse. A disease that swept through a camp taught survivors which remedies brought even small relief and which brought none. Suffering carved memories into the minds of those who endured it, and those memories became guidance for future generations. Healing required cooperation just as much as hunting did. When one hunter was injured, others had to take on extra work until he recovered, if he recovered. When a mother fell ill, someone else had to care for her children and keep the fire fed. Illness and injury rippled through the group. No one experienced them in isolation. Everyone paid a price. And because of that, everyone shared in the responsibility of recovery. Around the fire, healing became something close to ritual. Wounds were washed, herbs ground and applied, bones straightened and bound with careful fingers. Children watched these acts in silence, learning the motions that might someday save a life. Every act of care was a kind of lesson. Survival was not just about strength or speed, but about knowledge and empathy. These small victories against pain and sickness added up. A bone that mended straight meant a hunter who could return to the chase. A fever that broke meant another set of hands to build, gather, and watch. Every life saved strengthened the tribe. With each remembered remedy, humans became more than just hunters and builders. They became healers too. The world around them remained harsh, but now they had ways to survive not only its blows, but also its aftermath. They had fire to warm them, shelters to shield them, tools to protect and feed them, and hands that could mend what the wild tried to break. With each healed wound and each illness overcome, they gained more than just bodies that survived. They gained confidence that they could outlast more than just a single storm or a single night. They could outlast patterns of hardship. Still, healing was only one piece of the puzzle. The land itself had its own cycles, its own steady changes, seasons of plenty followed by seasons of scarcity. To survive over the long term, humans had to learn those cycles as carefully as they had learned to use their tools or their words. The Stone Age world was never steady. It swayed and shifted with the seasons. There were no calendars, no clock faces, no written logs of the passing years. People learned to read time through the land itself, the length of the daylight, the angle of the sun, the smell and taste of the air, the changing behavior of animals. Survival depended on noticing these signs and adjusting ahead of time, before the world turned against them. Spring was the season of return. After months of bitter cold, the snow melted, the rivers swelled, and the land seemed to breathe again. Plants pushed up through softened soil. Animals that had disappeared into shelter during winter came out to feed. For humans, spring meant movement. Camps were abandoned or shifted as groups followed new growth in fresh water. Hunters watched closely for the first reappearance of herds. Gatherers searched for tender new shoots and the earliest berries. Spring brought hope, but also urgency. To stand a chance in the next winter, they had to make full use of the months ahead. Summer brought warmth and abundance, but also new challenges. Days were long, nights mild. Food seemed to be everywhere. Rivers were full of fish. Forests and plains offered fruits, seeds, and game. But heat shrank water sources, forcing bands to walk greater distances. Insects flourished and spread disease. Predators were strong and well-fed, competing with humans for the same prey. To succeed in summer, humans had to be wise with their energy. They stored food in shaded pits or hung it high out of scavengers' reach. They hunted in the cooler hours of early morning or dusk, resting through the worst of the heat. Summer demanded timing and restraint. Autumn was different. It was the season of preparation. Even without counting days, people understood that the world was about to change again. Herds grew restless and started to move toward winter feeding grounds. Plants withered and dropped back into the earth. The air sharpened, carrying the first hints of frost. In these months, humans became tireless. They hunted more often and tried to collect more than they immediately needed, drying and smoking meat so it would last. They gathered roots and nuts that would keep through the cold. They reinforced their shelters, sealed cracks, and stacked up fuel for their fires. Everything was aimed at one goal: surviving what was coming. Then winter arrived, and with it, the hardest test. Food became scarce. The cold went beyond discomfort, digging into bone and muscle. Rivers froze. Snow buried the land and hid what little food remained. The big grazing animals often migrated far away. The plants that had fed them for months vanished. Winter wasn't something to conquer. It was something to endure. In the deep cold, people stayed close to their shelters and closer to their fires. They leaned heavily on what they had stored. Meat dried in the autumn sun, nuts and roots dug up months before. Hunters who ventured out moved through a quiet world of snow and ice where a misstep could mean frostbite, injury, or worse. They tracked hungry animals that were themselves near the edge of survival, knowing that each successful kill might feed their families for days. Through it all, the fire remained a lifeline. It was the thin, bright edge between life and freezing death. Without it, winter would have been nearly impossible to survive in many places. But winter gave gifts of its own. It taught patience and foresight. It forced humans to think not just of the next day, but of the next weeks, and even the next year. Each winter survived was proof that planning mattered as much as strength. Across generations, these seasonal rhythms shaped how humans lived and thought. They became migratory not just because animals moved, but because the land itself had a cycle. People learned when rivers would flood, when particular plants would bloom or fruit, when snow would trap them in place. Life became a repeating circle instead of a series of random shocks. They no longer felt only at the mercy of the world. They had learned to move with it. This was not just survival, it was the start of a deeper relationship with the earth. The land was no longer a chaotic enemy, it was a teacher. Its patterns offered both warnings and chances. Harsh seasons punished those who failed to prepare and rewarded those who watched and remembered. During long winter nights, elders likely recounted past years when the herds had come early or late, when the cold had been especially brutal, when food had run short or been unexpectedly abundant. These weren't casual stories. They were maps made of memory, passed down so younger people could navigate the future. Each story carried instructions disguised as recollection. The seasons also helped shape identity. Humans were no longer just wanderers responding to whatever they stumbled across. They became planners and keepers of knowledge. They measured their lives not in days or weeks, but in the turning of the year itself. And as the world's cycles became clearer, another truth stood out. Survival depended as much on people as it did on the land. Long winters and brutal summers drew humans closer, teaching them that working together was not just helpful, but essential. That cooperation would soon grow into something larger, a force that would turn scattered families into tight-knit tribes, bound together not only by need, but by shared memory and shared will. The seasons shaped how humans lived, but it was other humans who shaped how they survived. Alone, a person had almost no chance in the Stone Age world. One hunter could not hold off all predators, gather enough food, and keep a fire alive through the long nights. Survival was not an individual project. It was a shared construction, built on the strength of many people working together. Out of that reality came the bonds of the tribe. A tribe was more than a loose collection of families. It was a woven web of trust and shared duty. Everyone had a part to play. The most capable hunters brought down the biggest animals. Others helped carry, butcher, and preserve the meat. Skilled toolmakers shaped stone into sharp blades and strong spear points, giving hunters the tools they depended on. Elders, no longer quick enough to chase prey, became the tribe's memory, holding in their minds the stories of hard winters, dangerous valleys, and safe places to find food when everything else failed. Children grew up inside this network of watchful eyes. They learned to walk surrounded not just by parents, but by a circle of adults and older children. They watched hands chip stone, saw spears thrown, listened as their elders hushed them at certain sounds in the night. They weren't taught informal lessons. Their education happened in the flow of daily life, by copying, by trying, by witnessing how others survived. Around the fire, the tribe became more than a cluster of individuals gathered by chance. It became something like a single living body. Food was not hoarded by one person, it was shared. A successful hunt was a victory for everyone. A failed hunt, a hardship for everyone. In this way, survival became truly collective. Trust stopped being a luxury. It became the core that held everything together. There were conflicts, of course. Hunger, stress, and fear could stir up anger and resentment. But under the pressure of predators, storms, and rival groups, people had to find a way to move past these clashes. When danger loomed, a prowling cat, a sudden storm, or a hostile band approaching arguments faded into the background. The tribe had to stand together or fall apart. These bonds were strengthened not only by shared danger, but by shared rituals. Eating together around the fire was more than just refueling. It was a reminder that no one was truly alone. Stories passed from elders to children served both as history and warning. Tales of past hunts, narrow escapes, and terrible winters joined generations together, so that the past lived on inside the present. Grief, too, was shared. When someone died, it wasn't a private sorrow. It was a loss felt by all. The missing person had worked, hunted, watched, and laughed alongside everyone else. Their absence left a gap the whole tribe could feel. Yet even in mourning, the tribe found strength in each other. They still lit the fires, still went out to hunt, still told stories of the one who was gone. In doing these things together, they learned to carry loss rather than be broken by it. The tribe served as a shield against the unknown. In a world where threats could come from any direction, no single person could watch every shadow. Many eyes, many ears, many hands together created a kind of living defense. While some slept, others watched. When danger pressed in, the tribe responded as one, shouting, brandishing weapons, driving off predators with a wall of sound and sharp points. Within these bonds, a new thing quietly emerged: identity. An individual was no longer just someone. They were part of a specific group with its own ways of hunting, its own stories, its own preferred shelters and paths. These differences from group to group were the earliest fragments of what we now call culture. Every tribe carried a unique thread of human experience, woven out of the land they walked and the choices they made. Cooperation also allowed for specialization. Not everyone needed to do everything equally well. Someone with a keen eye for tracking might guide the hunts, Someone with patient, steady hands could become skilled at making tools. Someone with a long memory might become the one people turned to for advice about which plants healed and which harmed, or when certain animals appeared. No one person could master every skill, but the tribe as a whole could. That shared skill set created a safety net unlike anything humans had known before. A lone person could be injured or sick and have no one to help. In a tribe, if one fell ill, others hunted in their place. If one was hurt, others carried them, cleaned their wounds, and watched over them. If one died, their stories and lessons still lived in the mouths of those who remembered them. The tribe made survival something greater than what any single life could achieve. These bonds did more than keep people alive. They laid the groundwork for everything that was coming. Cooperation became a habit, then a value, then an expectation. The instincts forged in those early tribes, trusting others, staying loyal, working together, would continue to guide humanity long after stone tools and open fires had given way to fields and cities. As these tribes gathered around their flames, watching sparks rise into the night sky, they were doing more than just keeping the dark at bay. They were claiming a space within it. With tools in their hands and fire at their backs, their attention turned toward the tools themselves and how those tools would continue to change. The tribe's strength lay in its numbers, but its true power lay in what those numbers could make. Stone and bone became the raw materials of survival. Each new tool was shaped not only by need, but by thought and experiment. With every improvement, humans moved a step farther away from bare survival and a step closer to actively redesigning their world. The earliest stone tools had been simple flakes and crude choppers. But as generations passed, the craft evolved. Toolmakers learned that by striking a stone at just the right angle, they could produce cleaner, sharper edges. They discovered that certain types of stone like flint or obsidian broke along smooth, predictable lines, producing razor-like blades. Tool-making stopped being a game of chance and became a practiced skill. Bones, once only leftovers from meals, became another key resource. At first, they were just what remained on the ground. Gradually, humans saw their potential. A shard of bone sharpened into a point could pierce flesh and hide as well as stone. A hollow bone could hold small items, or act as a tube or whistle. Longer bones could form handles, spear shafts, or parts of composite tools. Where other creatures left skeletons to decay, humans turned them into new tools. Together, stone and bone formed an expanding toolkit. Stone blades sliced hides into manageable pieces. Bone needles pierced those hides, letting them be sewn into clothing. Stone axes chopped branches and split logs for firewood. Bone awls and punches poked holes in leather or bark. The human hand, by itself not very strong, gained new reach. Tools became extensions of muscle and intention. This transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental. Toolmaking required seeing what was not yet there. A toolmaker looking at a chunk of flint had to envision the shape hidden inside it, then take the steps needed to reveal it. The wrong blow could ruin a good stone. The right one could create a finely edged blade. Each success and each failure taught a lesson about cause and effect, about how the world responded to deliberate action. Children learned by sitting near those who crafted tools. They watched the rhythm of it: strike, turn, inspect, strike again. They learned to listen for the distinct sound of a good fracture. Over many attempts, their clumsy smashing became precise tapping. Knowledge passed not in spoken instructions, but in repeated actions. Bone tools brought even finer work. Bone could be shaped more delicately than stone. Hunters began using small, sharpened bone points on the ends of spears, giving them better penetration. Fish hooks carved from bone allowed people to pull food from rivers and lakes without relying solely on land animals. Rib bones turned into scrapers helped thin and soften hides for clothing and shelter. As tools improved, life changed in turn. Stronger weapons meant hunting larger game became less suicidal and more practical. One large animal, properly butchered and preserved, could sustain a tribe for days or weeks. This created pockets of time when the group did not have to scramble constantly for food. During these stretches, they could focus on refining tools, strengthening shelters, and teaching the young more thoroughly. Better clothing, stitched together from well-cut hides, made colder regions habitable. People could travel into windswept plains or higher, colder elevations and still survive. Containers made from hollowed bone, scraped wood, woven fibers, or sewn hides allowed them to store and transport food and water more effectively. Each innovation unlocked a new possibility, and each possibility nudged humans into environments that had once seemed unlivable. In the evenings, people repaired and reshaped their tools beside the fire. The soft tapping of stone on stone, the rasp of bone on rock, filled the spaces between conversation and silence. Those sounds were the music of thought. Each tool finished by firelight was a small act of planning for the days ahead. Some tools were made with more care than pure practicality required. Certain spear points were smoothed and polished, balanced with a precision that made them beautiful as well as useful. Some stones were shaped into symmetrical, refined forms that could have worked just as well if they'd been rougher. These touches suggested something new, a sense of pride and perhaps an early sense of aesthetics. Tools were not just for getting by. They were also objects people cared about. Some tools or ornaments began to hold meaning beyond their function. A beautifully crafted spear might be passed from parent to child. A carved bone pendant might be worn daily, not only as decoration, but as a sign of skill, status, or connection. Technology and identity began to overlap. What you carried and what you could make became part of who you were. With every leap in tool-making, humans grew bolder. They ventured into harsher climates, relying on better clothing and sturdier shelters. They took on larger, more dangerous prey, armed with sharper spears and more effective hunting strategies. The simple act of hitting rocks together had started a chain reaction that was still unfolding. Yet the earth was still full of challenges. For every tool that solved a problem, new problems emerged, new animals to face, new landscapes to cross, new kinds of danger to recognize. The land shifted. Climates cooled or warmed, herds changed their routes. Survival was never something won once and for all. It had to be earned again each day. But with stone and bone in their hands, humans had transformed themselves. They were no longer simply another animal in the food chain. They were tool bearers, planners, and inventors. Before long, those tools would let them face the biggest creatures on Earth: mammoths, giant bison, and other colossal beasts. Hunts that would test every bit of their strength, strategy, and unity. With sharper weapons and the backing of the tribe, humans turned their attention to the giants of their age. Massive animals roamed in herds: mammoths, great bison, and other enormous grazers. They were powerful, unpredictable, and capable of killing a human in an instant. But they also offered incredible rewards. One successful hunt could feed many people for a long time, provide hides for clothing and shelter, and bones for tools and building. Hunting such giants was never simple aggression. It was strategy from the very beginning. Tribes studied these animals, following them across open plains, watching where they fed, where they rested, and how they moved with the seasons. They noted which routes herds used to cross rivers or climb slopes. They watched the wind and learned how far a mammoth's nose could detect danger. Observing these patterns was the first stage of every hunt. When it came time to strike, the tribe moved as one. No single hunter could bring down an animal that large. It took a coordinated effort. Some people circled far around to position themselves ahead of the herd. Others pushed from behind and from the sides, yelling, waving torches, and throwing stones to direct the giants toward cliffs, bogs, or tight spaces where they could not easily escape. The air in those moments must have been thick with fear and ferocious focus. One misstep could be deadly. A mammoth's charge was like a moving wall, and a horned giant could toss a human aside effortlessly. Hunters had to hold their nerve, trust each other, and throw at just the right moment. Sometimes people used the land as a weapon. They drove herds toward concealed ravines or soft ground where the animal's size became a disadvantage. They might set brush on fire behind or beside the herd, guiding it forward with heat and smoke. Intelligence, coordination, and timing became more important than raw strength. Humans were small, but their minds allowed them to challenge even the largest animals. When a giant finally fell, it was both a victory and the beginning of a new task. Work exploded into motion. Dozens of hands cut and heaved, stripping away hide, separating meat, breaking bones for marrow and tools. A single carcass was like a small, temporary world of resources. The thick hide could become shelter walls or heavy winter clothing. Huge bones could be frames for dwellings, spear shafts, wedges, or hammers. Sinew became strong cord for binding and sewing. Almost nothing was wasted. For the tribe, such a hunt meant more than just a few full meals. It could mean security for weeks. Fires would burn with rich fat. People could eat until they were truly full, even picky about their portions. Children would have more than scraps. Elders would be honored with the best cuts. Those were the nights when the tribe felt the full strength of its unity. Together, they had faced down something immense and terrifying. Together, they had won. But not every attempt met with success. Some hunts ended in failure, with the herd escaping over the horizon, the tribe left exhausted and hungry. Worse, some ended in injury or death. A single well-placed kick or charge could kill a hunter outright or leave them too crippled to ever run again. Every chase of a great beast carried a sharp edge of risk. Even so, they kept going after those giants. Hunger left no alternative. The rewards of success were too great to ignore. The repeated challenge of hunting enormous animals shaped not just their bodies, but their minds. It taught them patience, coordination, and an understanding that bravery meant little without planning. After such hunts, as the meat roasted and the danger faded, people told and retold what had happened. Children listened wide-eyed as elders described the thunder of hooves, the moment of impact, the cry that went up when the animal finally fell. These weren't just tales of glory. They were practical instruction disguised as drama. Each story prepared the next generation for their own day on the hunt. The land still bears traces of these great hunts. In some places, archaeologists have found circles of mammoth bones or other large remains arranged in patterns that suggest more than random scatter structures built from what the giants left behind. These remains hint at how deeply such hunts were woven into life and ritual. By hunting these massive creatures, humans did more than grab a big meal. They took on a new role in the world. They weren't just opportunistic scavengers anymore. They became top-level predators, armed not with claws or fangs, but with fire, tools, and the capacity to work together. Even so, they never stopped learning from the animals they hunted, their migrations, their feeding behavior, their signs of fear and calm. In the shadows of those giants, humans learned to read the land itself with greater care. And those lessons, the quiet, constant teachings of earth, water, wind, and sky, would become their next great advantage. Because soon, survival would depend not only on the tools in their hands, but on how well they understood the world they walked through. Every hunt, every season, every long night around the fire taught humans something. But their greatest teacher was not the beasts they chased or the tools they made. Their greatest teacher was the world itself. The constant forces of wind and water, the steady turning of the stars, the shifting shapes of the land, these all spoke in ways that careful eyes and ears could learn to understand. To survive, humans had to become students of the earth. Long before farming or permanent towns, people realized that nature followed patterns. The sun's path across the sky marked the passing of each day. The growing chill in the air signaled the onset of colder months. The cries of migrating birds hinted at changing seasons. None of this was written down. It was stored in memory, built from observation, and passed one generation at a time, usually in the form of stories and habits rather than explanations. The sky was one of their first guides. By day, the sun's slow arc told them when they had time to hunt or needed to seek shelter. By night, the stars formed a kind of map. People noticed that some constellations appeared only at certain times of year. They learned to use them as markers, telling them when to move with the herds or return to familiar camps where food would be waiting. With no charts, no compasses, and no instruments, they navigated vast spaces by memory and instinct, guided by the same points of light that still shine above us. The ground beneath their feet was another type of scripture. Hunters learned to read it as if it were written language. A twisted blade of grass, a shallow print in damp soil, a scuff on a stone each sign revealed something about what had passed there and how recently. A deeper print might indicate a heavier animal. A crisp edge on a track meant it was fresh. Broken branches showed not only where something had gone, but how large it was and whether it had been moving quickly or slowly. They also learned to feel the earth, understanding the difference between soft, rain-soaked ground, and hard, dry soil, and what that meant for the animals that grazed or hunted there. The weather left clues. After a heavy storm, muddy lowlands might be rich in new plant growth or tracks. During drought, animals gathered near the last remaining water, leaving well-used trails that humans could find and follow. The wind carried its own information. Blowing in the wrong direction, it could carry a human scent toward wary animals, ruining a hunt. Blowing from predators toward camp, it could warn of danger before it came into view. Hunters learned to move upwind, so their smell would be carried away from their prey. Back at camp, a changing wind direction could signal a storm or shift in weather. Ignoring the wind was dangerous. Learning to use it turned an invisible threat into a tool. Water itself was a teacher. Rivers rose and fell with the seasons. Their levels told stories about distant melt or rainfall. The taste of a stream revealed whether it was safe to drink. People learned where fish gathered in slower, deeper pools or sheltered bends. They noticed that animal paths almost always led toward water sources. In a world without wells or stored supplies, understanding water's moods and paths was as critical as knowing how to make a fire. Plants were both allies and hazards. Some nourished, some cured, others poisoned. Learning the difference was a slow, often painful process. People watched how animals behaved. They saw which leaves were avoided and which were eaten. They noticed that certain herbs seemed to reduce pain or swelling, while others made sickness worse. Through trial, error, and bitter losses, they built a body of knowledge about the plants around them. What to eat, what to chew for relief, what to apply to wounds, and what to never touch. Every new remedy and every painful mistake were etched into tribal memory. The animals they didn't hunt still taught them things. Birds erupting suddenly into the air might reveal an approaching predator. The presence of wolves or vultures could hint at a fresh carcass nearby that could be scavenged. Grazing animals, by the way they fed or fled, showed where danger lurked or where the land was safe. Over time, humans learned that nearly everything around them was sending signals, if they knew how to look and listen. From all of this came a quiet kind of wisdom. It wasn't written, it wasn't systematic, and it wasn't science in the modern sense, but it was powerful. Humans understood that to fight the world blindly was to lose. They learned to work with its patterns, to hunt hardest when prey was plentiful, to retreat or conserve energy when storms raged, to brace for lean times when signs of scarcity appeared. It wasn't peace with nature. It was a working relationship, and that relationship gave them an edge. Elders in each tribe became the protectors of this wisdom. They remembered which valleys flooded each spring, which patches of forest always yielded certain roots, which hills signaled the direction of migrating herds. Around the fire, they shared this knowledge not as dry instruction, but as stories about times when the river rose too fast or when the birds changed their routes. These tales guided the young through patterns they had not yet lived through themselves. Such instruction turned every hardship into a future advantage. A failed hunt taught not only that prey was scarce, but why and where. A brutal winter became a cautionary tale about stocking more food or building better shelters. The world handed out lessons without mercy, but humans were uniquely able to remember and learn from them. These lessons also sharpened the mind. Noticing patterns, recognizing signs, and making predictions demanded more than reflex. It required attention and imagination. People had to connect what they saw now with what had happened before, and with what might happen later. Slowly, without knowing it, they were training their minds to think abstractly. That growing understanding would one day blossom into questions like, why do the seasons change? Nanyada, or what are the stars? But in those early days, it was enough simply to know that the wind, the sky, the ground, and the water could be read like a kind of living map. And that map was what carried humans into the next great challenge, a world that itself was about to change. The earth did not remain steady. Even as humans learned the language of wind and water, the land transformed under their feet. Ice crept forward. Forests died back and gave way to cold grasslands. New animals arrived while others vanished or moved beyond the horizon. When the world changed, humans had only two choices: adapt or disappear. The great ice ages advanced slowly, but their effects were immense. Temperatures dropped, Glaciers spread. Places that had once been green and generous turned into frozen deserts. Snow lingered longer and piled thicker. Rivers locked under sheets of ice. The seasons felt sharper, the cold more persistent. Animals that once roamed freely in certain areas migrated away, chasing warmth and food. Human groups had to follow or starve. Migration became a matter of life or death. Tribes walked for weeks or months, carrying what they could on their backs. They followed the faint traces of animal tracks, watched the sun and stars for direction, and leaned heavily on the memories of elders who had walked similar paths decades before. A single miscalculation, a river that was too wide to cross, a mountain range too treacherous, a valley with no game could doom them. But those who moved with the herds found new lands where survival was still possible. The cold forced new kinds of creativity. Hides had to be sewn into thicker, more insulating clothing. Shelters had to be stronger, dug deeper, and sometimes partially buried to capture heat and block wind. Fires had to be tended constantly, not as luxuries, but as necessities. Losing a flame in the heart of winter was not an inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. Hunting changed as well. Many familiar prey animals disappeared from certain regions. In their place appeared creatures perfectly adapted to the cold mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and other large, thick-coated beasts. They were dangerous and massive, but also rich sources of meat, fat, and materials. Hunting them demanded more advanced weapons, tighter cooperation, and a level of planning beyond anything required for small game. At the same time, the ice opened new paths. As glaciers locked up water, sea levels dropped and revealed land bridges that had once been submerged. Continents that had previously been cut off from each other became connected. Humans could now cross into entirely new regions, bringing their fire, tools, and stories with them. Some followed coastlines, learning to harvest fish and shellfish. Others ventured inland across open tundra, forests, or mountains. Each new place was a fresh test. People had to learn which plants were safe, which animals were dangerous, where water could be found, and how the seasons behaved in these unfamiliar lands. Sometimes what they knew from their old home helped. Sometimes it misled them. They adjusted, learned, and moved on. These great movements reshaped humans as much as they reshaped the map. Tribes split, mixed, and formed new groups. As people adapted to different climates and ecosystems, their bodies, tools, and traditions began to diverge. Different paths led to different ways of life, but they all shared the same core traits: adaptability, curiosity, and the willingness to travel into the unknown. Migration became not only a survival strategy, but a defining part of what it meant to be human. Other animals were tied strongly to specific environments. Humans were not. They carried their knowledge with them and could rebuild their lives in new places. As long as they had fire, tools, and each other, there were almost no limits on how far they could go. These changes in the earth also prompted deeper questions. To look out across a frozen plain, to watch the sun glint off endless ice, to see herds disappear into a white distance, these sights must have left strong impressions. Standing at the edge of a newly revealed land bridge or coastline, they were confronted with the sheer scale of the world. And as they moved across that expanding world, they didn't just bring their tools. They brought their ideas, their beliefs about the spirits of animals, the power of fire, the meaning of storms traveled with them. Around their fires at night in these new places, they began to ask larger questions. Not only, how do we survive? But why is the world like this? And perhaps even, what is our place in it? From those questions came something new: ritual and belief. Humans had always needed food, warmth, and safety, but they now needed something more. An answer, however small, to the vastness and uncertainty they saw around them. In a world that could freeze over, split open, or shift beneath their feet, they looked for meaning in the only place that felt steady: the glow of their own fires and the shared words spoken around them. When the world was vast, cold, and often merciless, humans drew close to their fires not only for heat, but for something deeper. Flames snapped and hissed, throwing long, shifting shadows along the walls of their shelters. In that moving light, people not only rested their bodies, they turned inward. They had learned how to hunt, build, travel, and adapt. Yet as they stared into the dark beyond the fire, they faced questions no tool could solve. The fire became more than a practical tool. It became a center, a place the tribe naturally gathered around at the end of each day. Here, when the immediate danger had passed and the tasks of survival paused for a few hours, the mind had room to wander. People spoke, not just about what they had done that day, but about what it all meant. In those quiet hours, they told stories. Some were simple accounts: how a hunt had gone, where the herd had turned, how the storm had broken. Others reached for explanations. Why had lightning split the sky? Why had sickness taken someone so suddenly? Why did winter always return? Their words wrapped these unknowns in meaning. The wind was no longer just air moving. It carried whispers or warnings. The stars were not just distant light. They became eyes or fires in the sky, or markers laid out by unseen forces. The animals they hunted and the land they walked were no longer just resources. They took on personalities, wills, and powers. People spoke of them with awe, fear, gratitude, and respect. These early beliefs didn't come from written doctrines or organized systems. They grew organically from the way the world pressed in on human lives. In the face of things they could not control, humans reached for ways to understand. Out of this came ritual. A hunter might murmur a few words to the spirit of an animal before or after a kill. A mother might raise her hand to the sky, silently asking for protection before a journey. People marked stones or their own skin with signs, lines, dots, patterns that carried significance even if no one could fully explain why. These acts were not meaningless habits. They were attempts to bring some order and predictability to a chaotic world. Fire itself became sacred. It chased away dark, softened the cold, and held predators back. Without it, people were helpless. With it, they were something more. Letting the fire go out was unthinkable. Someone always watched it. Children grew up being warned about its power and value, not just as a tool, but almost as a living presence that had to be fed, guarded, and respected. As seasons passed and hardships came and went, these beliefs deepened. When storms tore through their camps, when animals suddenly vanished from familiar grazing grounds, or when mysterious illness struck, people struggled to make sense of it. Perhaps they had offended a spirit. Perhaps something larger was testing them. Around the fire, these ideas were spoken aloud, weighed, and passed on. The elders took on a new role. They were no longer just keepers of practical memory where to find water when the herds moved. They also became voices of meaning. They told of times when the world had seemed even harsher, and yet the tribe had endured. They described strange events, unusual lights in the sky, dreams that seemed to come true, hunts that had succeeded against impossible odds. Their stories tied the struggles of the present to a larger narrative, one in which the tribe had a place beyond simple chance. For the young, these stories were a kind of double education. They learned practical things: when to move, what to avoid, how to behave during a hunt. But they also learned to look at the world as alive with forces that had to be respected. They were taught to bow their heads before a hunt, to offer the first bite of meat to the fire, or to draw a protective symbol on the ground before they slept. These were not empty gestures to them. They felt like part of what kept the group safe. Even death began to be seen through this lens. Burials became acts of meaning, not just disposal. Bodies were laid carefully in the ground, sometimes positioned in specific ways. Tools, weapons, beads, or ornaments were placed beside them, as if the dead might still need these things. This suggested a belief, however faint, that life might continue in another realm. Grief was mixed with hope, the idea that those who had gone on were not entirely lost. As tribes moved into new lands, these beliefs traveled with them, shifting and changing, but keeping their core. The details might differ from group to group, but everywhere, fire remained central. Whether they camped by a river, under sparse trees, or at the edge of ice, people gathered around it. In its glow, They reminded themselves that they were part of something that extended beyond hunger and cold. These early beliefs gave humans more than comfort. They gave them courage. When the world felt arbitrary and cruel, belief offered a sense that there was a pattern, even if they couldn't see all of it. Suffering could be endured if it seemed to have meaning. Ritual could make people feel less helpless in the face of storms, sickness, and death. Even if the spirits they spoke of could not be seen, the unity created by shared belief had very real effects. Belief itself became a kind of tool. It held tribes together when scarcity and fear might otherwise have torn them apart. It helped them step into darkness, brave long journeys, and endure stretches of loss. Over time, these ideas would grow into myths, religions, and complex spiritual systems. But in the Stone Age, it was simpler. A whispered word before a hunt, a gesture toward the sky, a shared story about why the world was the way it was. As humans learned to see the world not only through the lens of danger and need, but through the lens of meaning and hope, they grew ready for another shift. The same fires that warmed them and lit their rituals would soon burn beside something new, the first planted seeds. The long age of wandering and chasing would slowly give way to an age of tending and staying. The fires still crackled. The hunts still fed the tribe. The seasons still controlled much of daily life. But slowly, almost invisibly, a new idea was taking hold. For as long as anyone could remember, humans had lived by following the world-trailing herds, searching for wild plants, and leaving each place when it no longer gave enough. Now, their growing skill and understanding led them to a quiet question. Did survival always have to depend on the chase? That question began with simple observation. While gathering wild plants, people noticed that certain things grew where seeds had fallen before. A patch of berries that had been rich one year often returned the next, not by magic, but because fallen fruit left seeds behind. They saw that animals spread seeds in their droppings, and that new growth frequently appeared along well-used paths. At first, no one invented farming. Instead, they nudged what nature was already doing. After eating fruits, they tossed seeds near camp. Some of those seeds sprouted. They didn't set out to cultivate plants, but the pattern was there. Over years, they began to realize that where humans repeatedly dropped or buried seeds, edible plants sometimes appeared. The line between wild and tended blurred. They also discovered that certain spots seemed to give back more if they weren't stripped bare. A grove of nut trees or a patch of root plants would return stronger if not completely harvested. People began leaving some behind, maybe without fully knowing why, only that it seemed wise. When they found particularly rich stands of plants, they returned to them season after season, building up an understanding of how those places behaved over time. Without planning it, they started to shape the land. Seeds were scattered near their shelters. Over time, some of those seeds survived and produced food right next to camp. People began protecting these patches, driving off animals that might eat everything, avoiding trampling the soil too much. This was not yet full agriculture, but it was the first step, humans influencing which plants would grow where. The shift from pure hunting and gathering to planting was gradual and scattered across different regions. It wasn't a single discovery, but a long series of small insights accumulated through generations. Groups learned that if they moved less and stayed near places where plants reliably grew, life became slightly more predictable. That predictability was precious. This new way of feeding themselves required a new way of thinking. Hunting was immediate. You either brought back meat that day, or you did not. Planting, on the other hand, required patience and faith. You had to put seeds into the ground and wait, sometimes for months before seeing any result. Planning shifted from days and weeks to whole seasons. People had to imagine themselves in the future and act now on that imagined future's behalf. Fire, tools, and tribal bonds had taught them how to endure. Seeds taught them how to invest in tomorrow. As they scattered more seeds and returned to the same locations, their shelters became more permanent. Huts and tents were rebuilt in the same spots, year after year. Hearthstones grew black with repeated fires. People buried food, stored tools, and returned to find them again. They were still not fully settled, but they were no longer endlessly mobile either. Animals began to play a new role in this changing life. Some wild goats, sheep, and other grazers lingered near human camps to feed on discarded scraps or graze in the cleared land. At first, they were simply convenient targets for hunting. Over time, humans realized that keeping these animals within reach might be better than chasing them across miles. They began to guard them, guide them, and protect them from other predators. Before long, the line between wild herd and managed flock began to blur. None of this was safe or guaranteed. Crops could fail. Floods, drought, insects, or disease could wipe out a planted area. A group that relied too heavily on one patch of plants or one herd of animals might starve if disaster struck. Hunting was risky, but at least it gave quick answers. Farming and herding demanded trust in forces beyond immediate control: weather, soil, time. Still, the benefits were undeniable. A good harvest could last for months instead of days. Grain could be dried and stored, tubers buried and dug up later. Herd animals could be milked, bred, and eventually slaughtered, providing meat, skins, and bone on a schedule that people could somewhat influence. The constant, exhausting search for food eased, just a little. Free from the need to move constantly, some members of a tribe could spend more time on other things: refining tools, building sturdier homes, making containers, weaving fibers, and, importantly, thinking and talking. Human life gained new layers of complexity because of that small surplus of time and energy. The transformation from stone to seed was slow, but once it began, it could not easily be undone. Each generation added a little more to what the last had learned: better ways to plant, store, protect, and tend. Little by little, people crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer living purely at the mercy of wild cycles. They were beginning to influence those cycles themselves. Pressing seeds into the soil and then seeing green shoots push up was more than just a practical success. It created a new feeling: belonging to a particular piece of earth. Humans were not only passing through a landscape anymore. They were becoming caretakers, however imperfect, of small pieces of it. They were turning clearings into fields, camps into villages. But even as this new way of life grew roots, they did not abandon what had come before. They still kept fires burning. They still made and used tools of stone and bone. They still told stories, trusted their tribes, watched the stars, and remembered the long ages of movement and hunger. The past lived on inside the new, because no matter how deep the seeds went, the echoes of the older ages remained inside them, shaping their fears, their hopes, and the way they saw the world. Those first seeds had been planted. Fires burned each night in places where people now returned again and again. Tribes were slowly becoming settled communities. Yet everything that had come before, every hunt, every night watch, every stone struck into an edge, still lived in the people themselves. The Stone Age was not something they left behind. It was something they carried forward. You could see those echoes in the way they treated fire. Even if the threat of predators had lessened a little and the nights were safer near their homes, they still gathered around its glow. They still felt the old comfort in its warmth and the old unease when it burned low. Fire was no longer just a defensive line against the dark. It had become a symbol, a piece of ancient memory. It reminded them of the countless times their ancestors had survived simply by keeping one small flame alive. You could see the past in their tools: a polished metal blade or a carefully shaped hammerhead. When those eventually appeared, was not an isolated invention. It was the descendant of those first crude flakes of stone. Every improvement, sharper, stronger, more durable, was built on the discoveries of those who had sat in the dark, hitting rocks together. Each new edge carried a silent history within it. Their movements, too, still echoed their ancient paths. Even settled people looked to rivers, valleys, and stars the way their wandering ancestors had. They still read the sky for signs of storms and seasons. They still followed old routes to hunt, trade, or travel. Their bodies and instincts were tuned to walking long distances, watching the horizon, and feeling the land beneath their feet. The stories they told remained full of the old world. Long before they wrote on clay or paper, voices carried history. Elders still spoke of great beasts, terrifying winters, and dangerous journeys, even after the mammoths and many other giants were gone. These stories did more than entertain. They passed on expectations about danger, effort, courage, and cooperation. Through them, The memory of the Stone Age stayed alive long after its literal conditions had changed. Most of all, the old world lived on in human relationships. The tribe, the small, tight-knit group, had been the first and most reliable fact of human life. Without it, no one would have survived long enough to see settled fields or constructed homes. Even as people began to live in larger communities and, eventually, in towns and cities, the need for close bonds remained. People still formed families, friendship circles, and small groups within the larger whole. They still felt safest when they were known and needed. The Stone Age was not just an era. It was the period when the basic shape of being human was formed. The habit of gathering around a common light, the urge to share food, the instinct to teach the young, the drive to help the injured, the pull to tell and listen to stories. The same traits that had once helped people survive nights full of predators now help them survive the complexity of increasingly organized societies. Even now, with electric lights instead of torches, with screens instead of cave walls, those echoes haven't faded. When people sit around a campfire, they instinctively form a circle. When the power goes out and the house goes dark, something ancient stirs a mix of unease and closeness. When we look up at the stars and feel quiet and small, we are feeling what our ancestors felt. We may live in cities and carry devices in our pockets, but many of our deepest reactions, our fear of the dark, our comfort in company, our fascination with flame, our urge to belong, are much older than any building or machine. They were forged over tens of thousands of years when survival meant braving cold nights, watching for predators, shaping stone, and learning to read the land. If you strip away the noise of modern life, you can almost sense those early voices, the clack of stone against stone, the first spark catching in dry grass, the shout of hunters in the distance, the murmur of people gathered closely under a star-filled sky, speaking in sounds we no longer understand, but driven by needs and hopes we recognize all too well. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. The Stone Age ended, but it did not vanish. It lives on in the structure of our minds, in the routines that still comfort us, and in the stories we still tell about who we are and how we came to be. And so, from the first spark of stolen fire to the first deliberate seed pressed into soil, from crudely chipped stones to carefully told stories around the hearth, the road of survival stretched across countless generations. Every hardship, every adaptation, every small discovery was carried forward by people who refused to give up. We are their descendants, the ones who can stand in the dark without immediate terror, because somewhere, long ago, someone figured out how to make light. The ones who can plan, build, and imagine, because earlier tribes learned to share knowledge and trust one another. The safety and comfort many of us know today were built on their relentless struggle against a world that rarely offered anything for free. Yet their presence has not vanished beneath all we've built. We still look up at the same sky. We still gather around sources of light, even if they are made of wires and glass. We still tell stories late into the night. In every one of these acts, there is something older at work, something given to us by people who lived in caves, slept under hides, and walked barefoot over rough ground. The Stone Age was not just a distant chapter. It was the beginning of everything that followed. It gave us hands trained to shape, voices trained to share, minds trained to look beyond the moment, and hearts that know we need one another. No matter how advanced our tools become, that foundation remains. In many ways, we have never completely left that age. Our fires are brighter, our tools sharper, our fields more orderly, but the same human heart beats in our chests. The same one that once listened to a night full of unknown sounds and chose to keep going anyway. The next time you sit quietly in the dark, watching the glow of a candle, a screen, or an actual flame, think back. Think of those first people who cupped embers in their hands. Think of the hunters who chipped stone until their fingers bled. Think of the watchers who kept their eyes on the darkness so others could sleep. Think of the children who pressed their hands against cave walls to say, "I was here." We are here because they endured. Their story in every way that matters is still our story.